Back again, and welcome back to what's going to be another short video so I can demonstrate a little bit about that new action subscriber class that's going to be in relation to the registration controller that we've created in our last video. So this video is purely going to be about putting a little bit of context into that new action class and all the lifting that it does in the background for us. So I've changed my editor to a black background because that white one was hurting my eyes. It's late at night, it's pretty dark outside, so we're going to change that to the black theme just to help with my eyes at the moment. But we're going to be going into the core part of a framework. I'm going to bring that file up and I'm going to sort of like talk you through all the various parts of what it's doing, right? So let's just jump straight into it. So I'm going to go to my vendor directory, which is where I'm already at. I'm going to find our core directory, find a source. Let's bring this out a bit, and let's find that base folder. Let's find domain, actions, and new actions. Let's just close this down for a bit so we got all the space. So this single action class, new action, sole responsibility is to persist data to our database. So any of our controllers can utilize this particular class because the logic that it contains is going to be the same across any controller for persisting data to our database, and all the different parameters that this execute method accept is going to cater for the different controller objects that we're going to be using it in. So as I've explained in previous videos, these single action classes, it's got one job, and depending on what that file or the class name is, that is the job it's going to be doing. New action means we're going to be inserting a new item in our database, and all of these classes is implementing a single method, which is this execute method, which takes in all of these arguments, right? And as I've explained in the last couple of videos, we've touched on all the parameters and what they're doing. But what I want to show you is the process of how I'm implementing persistent data to our database. And as you can see, the first line, it's checking that our form builder component exists, and it's going to be calling the isFormValid method, which is going to accept one argument, which is going to be the name of that form. And as I've mentioned in the last video, the name of the form is the name attribute for our submit button. So whatever we gave to that name attribute is what we're going to be getting from this particular method. And it's a convention behind that as well, because it's going to get, or it's looking out for the method name and the controller class that that method is in, right? So we're going to extract that from this particular method. As I'm saying again, our form builder, while when you're using the form builder component, we're going to have CSRF token automatically injected into each of our form. So we have to check that the form or the CSRF token is valid, and once it's valid, we can proceed with the rest of the process. So this line right here pretty much is saying we're going to take whatever is submitted via a form or an API, and note that is Ajax or normal method is checking whether the data coming in is from an API stream or if it's being submitted via a form, and it's going to take whatever is being submitted as an array, and it's going to be passing it to this wash method, which is a method in our entity, within our entity class, our base entity, right? So all of our entity classes will have access to all of these methods. And you can see how we're accessing that. We're accessing those entity through our repository, which is our model, right? Because in our base model, I'm returning the entity that is related to that particular model, right? And we're getting that entity through the third argument within our base, within our model class. So if I bring up one of our model class, let's quickly show you. If I go to model, to app directory, go to model, just pick anyone. So we get our role model. You can see the third argument is asking for the entity for that particular role. So that is what we're returning in our base model, right? So we can safely assume that the entity that we're going to be getting back within this method is going to be the user entity, because the user entity is what we was working on when we were using our registration controller, right? So we can expect to get back, or we've already defined, let's bring that up again. So in our registration controller, we've defined user entity within that execute method, and we're also importing the user model through this repository property, which is what we're accessing right here, and we're calling that get entity, which is going to return the user entity, right? Let's collapse this again. So this process right here is going to return, it's going to take in that data, whether it's going to be an API or data submitted from a form, and it's going to sanitize it and return it as a object, as an entity or a collection object, right? Which is what we're storing within this entity collection variable. So once we get that data back, we're going to then create another variable called action, which is going to store the result of this particular process. And it's going to be a boolean, could either be true for success or it's going to be false if it failed, right? So what we're doing is we're saying controller repository, and we're going to get the repo, and on that repo method we now got access to our data repository. And I'm going to also link another video that's I'm going to try and explain a little bit more about the data repository and all the functions and methods that they contain and how they relate to what we're doing. But I'm going to keep this video small because I just want to explain this particular single action class and how it relates to what we did in our last video, which was creating that registration controller. So we're calling the get repo method, then we're going to be chaining on the validate repository method, right? Now this is a method that doesn't do nothing by itself. What this method does, it creates validation class on the fly, right? And I will explain how it's doing that in the next video. But this method takes in a few arguments, but in this single action class I'm only using 2 of those arguments, and the first one is going to be the entity collection, which is going to be the data that's coming back from this method as an object, and the second argument is going to be the entity object itself, which is going to be the user entity, or the second argument within this particular method, right? And that is how it's creating those validation class on the fly. Now, so once we call this method, we're then going to chain on the last method, which is going to be persist after validation, which is simple persisting the data to the database once it's been validated, right? And there's no error. So once that process is complete, we're going to assume that this action variable is going to be true, right? So we're going to say if action, we're going to dispatch the particular event, so we can have our listeners listening for this event when it fires, and we're going to get access to all the context that we're posting back to this particular event, right? So that's pretty much what this single action class is doing. Its sole responsibility is to persist data, persist validated data to our database, right? And then return or give us back some context which we can then have listeners subscribe to, so we can then do other stuff with that particular data. So that's a little bit of context on the single action class, and you know that every single action class sort of like has very similar step, with the only difference being the logic that it's implementing, right? This logic for this class is implementing persisting data to our database, right? So that's pretty much what I wanted to explain regarding this class. And I'm saying I'm going to be explaining to you what these methods are doing and how they relate to our controller on our models. So stay tuned, because I'm going to be dropping that video right after this one.